All right. Okay, as we are settling down, let's just quickly give a big round of applause for the session that we've just had now before the tea break. All right, so ladies and gentlemen, we are running behind schedule just a little bit, so I'm going to ask that you bear with me when I start pushing, that at least we move, all right? Okay, so getting into the second panel for the day, titled Disinformation and Misinformation as a Threat to Democracy and Society and Security. I do not want to waste any time. I will call now onto the stage my learned colleague, Dr. Anslem, to please. He will be facilitating this panel, and of course the panelists who will be part of this discussion, I also ask them to make their way to the stage, please. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, all protocols duly observed. Misinformation and disinformation, and to an extent, malinformation are no longer new phenomena in our society. However, they have taken new significance recently with the widespread availability of sophisticated forms of information and communication technologies. The sharing of text, images, videos, or links online, for instance, allows information to go viral to the extent that they can jeopardize national security by altering a nation's information landscape. Their presence can also undermine diplomatic relations, thereby posing significant risk to global security. It is no doubt, therefore, that advocacy groups, organizations have cautioned that these phenomena created by generated AI, including deepfakes, could utterly impact democratic processes such as elections. In an international conference hosted some months back by our university and the Department of Politics and its partners, titled AI Elections and the Future of Democracy, Global Experiences and Directions, we noted that with this year earmarked as one of the biggest elections year in history, the risk posed by disinformation, misinformation to democracies around the globe has never been this greater. So, ladies and gentlemen, it is with these words that I hereby introduce the second panel for today. And the title, as Dr. Zondo highlighted, is Disinformation, Misinformation as a Threat to Democracy and Security. Our speakers for the day that will take us through this topic and these themes are Dr. Leon Hartwell. He's a senior associate London School of Economics, London, right? Thank you. Mrs. Karen Allen, senior consultant, Emerging Threats in Africa, the Institute of Security Studies. And our own Prof. Mare from the Department of Communications and Media. With that said, I would like to head on straight to some questions. I will start with Dr. Leon. In this era of AI, I call it an era of AI, exactly. How does information, disinformation, misinformation affect the integrity and stability of democratic institutions? And if so, is it possible for disinformation to erode public trust in government and in democratic processes?
Thank you, Chair, and good morning to everyone, all protocol observed. Just so that you know about my background, I'm a dual citizen both of South Africa and the United States. So that's the kind of perspective that I come from. I'm so glad to be here at the University of Johannesburg. Thank you. First of all, let me just say that disinformation, first and foremost, promotes this process of othering. It creates a us versus them situation, which I think is incredibly dangerous. So it divides us among ethnic or racial lines, or between vaccinators and anti-vaxxers and so on. And at the same time, I think disinformation during this age of AI, as our chair pointed out, also sows doubt about our democratic institutions. I would also argue that democracy is not a permanent state of affairs. And when these liberation heroes who are here today, and thank you for what you've done, when you are no longer with us, you know, the question is whether the born frees will continue to honor your legacy, to continue to promote liberty and democracy for others, or will it be a generation of born frees questioning the legacy of Nelson Mandela and your legacies and you know, the values that you fought for so hard. I fear that there is a risk of democratic backsliding happening around the world. And I'll kind of open the discussion by just talking also a little bit about the United States also. I was in Washington, D.C. during the elections. I walked through the halls of the White House 2 days before the election, thinking about what a possible Trump or Harris administration would mean for this topic on disinformation. And I'm afraid to say that democracy is under severe threat. I think this situation is going to worsen going forward, especially for the next 4 years. And I think it's really important to look at what is happening in the United States to understand how it's going to impact how it's going to impact globally on us. The reason being because all the major tech companies are situated in the United States. That means the United States has a massive role in terms of governing how these organizations operate. And I think some of the discussions I had in Washington, D.C. were quite disturbing. Some of my friends who specialize on these issues on disinformation talked a lot about how they were worried how right-wing groups intensified attacks against disinformation research and monitoring efforts. That meant for the past 4 years, organizations like America First Legal, or AFL, have been going after relentlessly targeting initiatives like the Stanford Internet Observatory, or SIO, the DFR Lab at the Atlantic Council, and the Center for Internet Security. These organizations have been monitoring disinformation, have been exposing, you know, whether it's right-wing organizations or Russian organizations working on promoting, you know, propaganda. At the same time, we've also seen that the Republicans have established this so-called Weaponization Committee. The Weaponization Committee also went after tech, arguing that they've been over-regulating the role of these big tech companies, and they wanted to strip that back. They've also, and the combination, I think, of some of these conservative organizations together with some of these government officials is that they've made it more expensive to monitor disinformation, but also to put pressure on social media companies, you know, to roll back the role that they've been playing in trying to, you know, inoculate our information systems from disinformation. I should also say that Of course, there are divergent approaches between the US and the EU. I'm happy about that. I think the EU has established more robust regulatory measures in order to try and counter disinformation. That means that they've put the onus on tech companies. They can actually fine social media companies, whether it's Facebook or X or whatever the case may be. And I think it can amount to to a maximum of 6% of their global revenue if they violate these terms. They also have more privacy legislations in place, which means that these companies can't just mine our data, because the problem is when they have the ability to have access to all our data, it's more easy to manipulate us for good or bad. And then finally, coming back to this particular event, I think it's incredibly important that African citizens and governments and universities, like the University of Johannesburg, is part of this discussion on disinformation. Either you have agency and you fight for freedom, you fight for what is right, or you will be a victim for what is to come. So I want to thank you again for having me here. I hope today that I would also get to talk a little bit about the Russia-Ukraine war in relation to disinformation, as well as the Balkan region, where I spend a lot of time. Thank you.
Thank you, Leon. Thank you for those words. Our next question goes to Karen. We've recently had elections here in SA, as you all know. What have we observed in recent elections by way of attempts to deliberately distort the information environment and potentially challenge democratic norms and processes? Yes.
Thank you, and again, thank you for having me. And I'm just going to make a little a health warning. You can hear the British accent. I've lived in South Africa for 16 years, and prior to that lived in Kenya. And I'm British, but my family are originally from Eastern Europe, so much of what we've discussed today has got huge resonance. I'm also going to say another thing very briefly, is that, when we're talking about disinformation, and we're talking about the South African elections, people say, well, we look at social media platforms, and are they not just sharing the kind of stuff that we talked about in our newspapers, or that we talk about in the town square, or we talk about among our friends, or if you're an old fossil like me, you used to read it in a newspaper, a physical newspaper. And the key thing, and I think this is really important when we're talking about what we've observed in the South African elections, or any elections, but I'm going to talk about the South African elections more briefly, is that what these platforms do is they privilege what is popular over what is true. Okay, so what you are receiving in terms of your social media feeds are determined by algorithms, and that effectively determines your version of the world in many respects. The counter to that is that we have a very robust traditional media here, and that is one of the ways of defending ourselves against disinformation. You might have heard the reference to the fourth estate. The media holds power to account. And when I'm talking about traditional media, I mean media that are subject to codes of conduct, that have double sourcing, and that have a sense of accountability. So what have we observed during the elections in South Africa? Well, we've done a little bit of research for ISS that's looked specifically at this. And we have seen what's best described as an active and complex market for influence. What that means is that we saw 26 million people use social media platforms. Among those, we've seen a mixture of ideologically driven influencers and an expanded market for paid influence. People who are paid in order to amplify certain hashtags, in the same way that you might be an influencer that gets paid to promote sneakers or to promote makeup. You may be paid to promote a particular narrative or a particular point of view. Our interest isn't just in terms of what is being said, but how it's being said. So you'll hear us talk about gaming the algorithm. We saw quite a lot of activity to manipulate the way you and I receive our information by being able to trick the algorithm and build engagement. I'm not a social network analyst. I work with very smart people that are able to do this. My background is as a journalist. But what we were able to observe was quite a lot of manipulation and game in the algorithm, which determines what we see during elections. We saw early seeding of narratives during the elections, divisive narratives, particularly this narrative of a rigged election, attacking the IEC, attacking one of the key pillars of our democratic institutions. And we saw attempts to try and sow divisions and pick up on other narratives that are sensitive in a South African context. So typical narratives that we saw were targeting the credibility of not only the Independent Electoral Commission, targeting the voting process, targeting the commissioners themselves. And that's not to say they're not beyond reproach, but this is a coordinated campaign to be able to amplify and sow the seed of doubt many, many months before the election happened. We saw targeting of the voting process. We saw framing of foreign-funded NGOs as being instruments of foreign manipulation. So Media Monitoring Africa was particularly singled out for this. And we've seen other narratives, for example, a xenophobic narrative being used to try and sow division and discord. And it's quite a deliberate attempt to try and undermine the information environment. We talk about the information environment. Of course, a lot of people are saying, did we see a lot of foreign influence? And it's very, very difficult to actually measure foreign influence operations. And what we are keen actually to look specifically at a study looking specifically at this. But what I can tell you is we did see certainly the influence of some foreign narratives, the Russia-Ukraine narrative, the Israel-Palestine narrative, in terms of the volumes of conversations during the course of the South African elections. They were very small. They were very, very small in terms of the... So what that means is the total number of conversations that were happening that were using those geopolitical touchpoint issues to amplify other stuff that was happening in South Africa was quite small. But nevertheless, it's there. And some influencers that we were able to speak to talked to us about being approached directly by nation-state actors and offered material to be able to amplify those narratives. So I'm happy to talk in a bit more detail about how it gets done. I don't want to go into too much detail, but what we saw as a counterpoint, because there is a good news story that goes with this, is unlike Kenya, where we've seen elections 2 years ago, and we saw inauthentic engagement, so deliberate spats between mainstream media and social media influencers to effectively engage adversarially and to build their own networks. We saw a really, really robust media in South Africa that was able to call out fake news before it happened, because a lot of them were working with fact-checking organizations. But we also saw very, very strong history of journalism in South Africa that was robust, that was able to call out certain disinformation narratives as and when they happened.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you. Prof, this one is going to be very intriguing as well. 30 years into South Africa's democracy, and a lot that is being said about misinformation and disinformation. Do you actually think that these phenomena has actually impacted our democracy in one way or the other? What should be your take on it?
All right. Thank you so much. I really appreciate this time, and also thank you so much for everyone who has made this possible for us to meet and deliberate about this very important issue. I think I want to start from an understanding that disinformation is not new. It's not new. It's just always been there. It's only that maybe social media and all these other technologies that we are using have amplified it and given it a lot of reach and impact in our society, but it has always been there. And unfortunately, what we have often seen in terms of our research is that disinformation often uses what we call societal fault lines. So any society has got its own fault lines. And any society, because it has got its own fault lines, it creates arteries through which disinformation can transmit itself. For example, it could be around nationality, it could be around race, it could be around ethnicity, it could be around gender, it could be around class. So what I'm trying to say is that disinformation often uses existing channels to find and to seep itself into the mainstream society. South Africa, being multicultural, multilingual, often find itself in that kind of space where it cannot run away from disinformation. It often uses the same kinds of channels that I'm talking about to wreak havoc, as we have already listened to many other people that have talked before me. But I just want to say that when we talk about the impact of disinformation on democratic institutions, I think we need to pause a little bit and say, what kind of impact does disinformation has? Is it impact on the electoral process itself? Is it impact on civic participation? Is it impact on people that actually participate in elections? So, for example, you can see that certain kinds of disinformation target politicians, for example. It could be women in politics, for example. It could be the electoral management body, for example, as we saw in the last couple of months. True. It could be politicians themselves, it could be political parties themselves, but it could also go beyond that and even target observers. And we have seen that. If you have seen what has been happening in most elections in Africa, observers have been targeted. For example, the recent elections in Zimbabwe, for example, last year, we saw what happened with the former deputy president of Zambia, Amumba, who was targeted vociferously by disinformers throughout that electoral process. So what I'm trying to say is that when we look at the impact of disinformation on democracy, it is so multifaceted. We need to look at various institutions that are targeted and that are also affected. From where I sit, I would say that there are things that I call the Ds of disinformation. So what does it do? It demobilizes people. That's the first D that I can talk about. It demobilizes people. People feel like the election is already rigged, so why should I go and vote? The election is already rigged in favor of so and so, so why are we going to waste our time and vote? Because already we know this outcome is already set. But over and above that, disinformation can delegitimize the whole process. So why should we participate in a process that is already delegitimized? But also, it also deceives people. So there's a lot of deception that also comes with disinformation. But it also goes beyond that. It also sows discord in society. Yes. So, for example, in societies where there are multicultural, multilingual, and also multinationalities existing there, it can sow discord and even lead to violence. It can lead to conflict, as we have seen, for example, what is happening in Mozambique right now. It's a classic case where disinformation can be weaponized for discord, but also ultimately for conflict. So I think, let me stop there, but essentially what I'm saying is that we need to understand that disinformation has always been there. It only changes as technology changes and people that actually use it take advantage of the technological shifts and changes that happens in society.
Okay, fine. Thanks, Prof. Thanks for those clarifications. Before we get into the Q&A, I would just like to get through some more questions to our speakers. Leon, you spoke earlier on about the U.S. elections and how it turned out. From your standpoint, right? From your vantage point, would you say that disinformation or misinformation played a key role to how the elections turned out to be with Trump? With Trump's victory?
I think, and I'm going to be very careful how I answer this because you use the word key role. For me, it's not just the day of the election or even the weeks prior to the election. It has to do with what happens in the months and years prior to the election. That's why I also put a lot of emphasis earlier on what happened over the last 4 years. And as was pointed out, disinformation is not just something that you manufacture somewhere. It's sort of based on something they said. They always say the best propaganda is 80% truth, 20% lies, right? So there needs to be a little bit of credibility to whatever you're saying. When you're looking at disinformation campaigns prior to this election, especially foreign ones, for example, like Russian foreign disinformation in the United States, there is evidence, for example, that they supported this group Tenet, for example, right? And it consisted of a group of media influencers in the United States. These guys were already promoting far-right conspiracies, the big lie theory, the idea that their ideas are being censored by social media and so on. So and Russia has given millions to these individuals. I think the case is still under investigation. So we've also seen sort of these doppelganger tactics where you now have new websites being put up, and it looks like a legitimate website. It looks like it has the same font as, let's say, the Washington Post or the New Yorker or whatever the case may be. The name might even look similar. And the articles are beautifully written, which we've not seen in the past. So in the past, for example, there were many spelling errors or language errors, whatever the case may be. So it was easy for us to identify, oh, this might come from Russia because they keep on making these same mistakes. They use this idiom in an incorrect manner. But now they can write it in Russian or Chinese, whatever the case may be, feed it through an AI tool, and then they have a beautifully written piece there which looks legit because you can really tap into the fears of specific individuals. Then, I mean, we've seen some of the same tactics as last time, as in earlier rounds of elections, where there were bots and all those kind of things. But I think with the development of AI, which we've mentioned a few times already, it makes propaganda a lot easier. It makes the promoting propaganda a lot easier. Those of you who have invested in companies like NVIDIA, you would know that if you invested something in January, you put a pot of money in there, your investment has grown by 140%, 140%. So the AI market is serious, and that also includes, why we need to discuss what happens with Alphabet, the parent company of Google, Meta, the parent company of Facebook, and all these social media organizations. Thank you.
All right. Karen, we've been speaking about AI, generative AI, or deepfake. Do they actually pose a threat to information, to the information environment?
If they're good enough,
yes,
and if they're believable enough. And I think there's deep fakes and there's deep fakes and there's cheap fakes. So let's talk about the South African elections again, shall we, in terms of what we saw. There were probably about 8 deep fakes during the course of the South African election. Okay, about 8 of them. Not huge. I don't know if people saw them generally. There was they were used for either narrative endorsement, or they were used to endorse a particular candidate, or they were used for satirical purposes. But we had, for example, Trump endorsing the MK party. We had Eminem endorsing EFF. But we also saw the use of AI to tap into, again, narratives with potential real-world consequences. And that's what we have to keep reminding ourselves when we're talking about social media platforms. They have real-world consequences. They have the potential to whip up tensions and to seed, again, mistrust of the other. So we saw quite a lot of generative AI being used to create images of burning buses and with particular political parties emblazoned on the buses. I think the reality is that if the deep fakes become believable enough, and I don't think we saw genuinely believable deep fakes, and we didn't see them used at scale in South Africa. But if they become believable enough and the ability to create really, really sophisticated deep fakes is there, and in Africa, and South Africa in particular, we don't have the guardrails, and I'll tell you what I mean by that in a minute, in terms of creation of the deep fakes, but it distorts reality to the point that at some point the deep fake becomes more believable. The avatar that is speaking becomes more believable than the actual truth. So yes, because you can then get that particular deep fake to say whatever you like. I think one of the big challenges is that the big platforms that promulgate the deepfake technology, but also the AI companies that create them, do not understand the particular touchpoint issues in the South African environment. And what I mean by that is, I can create a deepfake using certain prompts, and it may well be a politician's name, it may be a party, it may be a setting, burning bus, in Cape Town 2 weeks up until the election, and I will get a deep fake of a character that I can choose, and the AI will allow me to create that. In another setting, in some European countries and in America, the AI model will not allow me to do that because there have been inbuilt safeguards. And I think one of our biggest challenges in this part of the world is trying to get the AI companies to take us seriously and to realize that although we're not seeing deepfakes at scale here, we have an opportunity to be able to educate them about why we need the same kind of guardrails in this part of the world. One final thing is where we will see AI possibly being used more extensively than simply the creation of deepfakes, is for amplifying at scale text messages. So, we use ChatGPT. Being able to use large language models to be able to create large volumes of material and disinformation that you can belt out at scale. I think that's where we're more likely to see the use of AI in the next few years, and possibly in the next election in 2026, as opposed to a proliferation of deepfakes. We were all looking for them, and it didn't happen.
Thanks. That's quite interesting. Prof, we spoke about building resilience, right? Against misinformation and disinformation. Are there any regulatory frameworks that can be used actually to counter or to build resilience actually?
Thank you so much for that. Unfortunately, in Africa, as Karen has rightly pointed out, we are net receivers and net users of other people's technologies. And because of that, we are at the tail end in terms of priority. We are not a priority market for these kinds of technology companies. We are pretty much a marginal market. Yes, they see us in terms of numbers to say, Africa has got 1 billion people. That's a market. But that's as far as they go. So they are not really interested in investing in technology that can actually, make sure that there's resilience within our own markets. As she rightly pointed out, if you can do the same kind of fake or video in America, you will probably not be able to circulate it very far, because before you get it out, already there are safeguards inbuilt within the system to flush it out. But here you can get away with murder. So what am I saying? I think the issue of regulating digital platforms is an elephant in the room. Unfortunately, our governments are not sophisticated enough to understand what needs to be done. They don't even understand how to go about doing it. And what we have seen because of that is what we call internet shutdowns. Internet shutdowns are an example of how African governments are trying to deal with platforms. They are trying to regulate platforms through that. And I think that is the only way we can understand. It's an alternative way of regulating. I'm not promoting internet shutdowns, but I'm saying you need to understand internet shutdowns as an alternative approach to regulating platforms that you don't have control over. That's essentially what they're trying to do. So they're saying, because we can't do anything about you, you operate from Silicon Valley, what do? We shut the internet and you don't have access to us. Of course, it has got the ripple effect in terms of the economic impact that it has, but I think in terms of trying to regulate companies that you don't have control over, it's an approach that we are already being seen as being normalized in many African countries. Like right now, as we speak, Mozambique right now, I don't know how many days they've been without internet now. Yeah. Again, it shows you that they are trying to regulate digital platforms, but they don't have the levers. They don't have the economic levers, but also even the technical levers to try and make sure that they keep this tech in check. It's different from Joe Biden. It's different from Trump, who can pick up a phone and say, Mark Zuckerberg, what are you doing? Can you please slow down the volume in terms of things that... We can't do that here. We can't do that. Because they would tell you, who are you? And they don't even listen to you anyway. So that's the problem. So we really need to make sure that instead of just focusing on regulating this platform, we also need to make sure that digital literacy, I think fact-checking organizations in Africa are really doing amazing job in trying to push back, but I think we need to go beyond that, and that's why I'm saying the idea of actually going for digital platforms regulation is long overdue in Africa. Unfortunately, our African Union does not have the power like the Brussels effect that we see. When they pass laws, they can actually be seen, being replicated across the world. Here, the African Union does not even do that. So it's each country on its own, it has to find ways in which it comes up with its own regulatory mechanisms to try and push back. Yes. And most of these African countries, because they lack the regulatory sophistication and also the technical sophistication, they end up just using internet shutdowns, because those are the easiest and the soft target that they can use actually to regain some kind of control over this changing information ecosystem. So I'll stop there.
All right. Thanks very much, Prof. Thanks very much. Please, can we have a round of applause for our speakers? I would like to open now the floor for Q&A. I think due to time, I think we'll just take 3 questions from the floor. Please, can the mic? Okay, we have 1, we have 2. Okay, we have another hand here. Dr. Zondo, can I extend? I want to just put you on the spot. Just put you on the spot there. On the spot, I'll say no. All right. Just 3 questions to our speakers.
Okay, no problem. My question is for Dr. Hartwell. So, with regards to America, like whether Democrats or the Republican win, it seems like they have some sort of, they keep moving forward towards a specific sort of like viewpoint. What do you think America got right in terms of democracy that other countries that I will not mention are sort of failing to get? Like I said, whether the Democrats or the Republicans win, they seem to be, overall, they might fight in terms of certain policies, but they seem to be moving towards a specific direction. Thank you.
I think we should just get let's just get the questions, then our speakers can respond.
Good afternoon, everyone. I have a question for Dr. Leon. I wanted to ask regarding the US elections and how you say that it has a huge impact on the globe. Regarding the US elections, there's been a lot of movements on social media speaking about how there's a recount for the Harris elections. They spoke about how due to unsealed, improperly sealed tabulators, the ballot tabulators, there would be a recount. Would you say that this is disinformation or misinformation? Because they said that there's a joint fundraising committee where half of the donations made or contributions made will go to Harris's campaign and the other half will go to Harris for President recount account. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
Hi, thank you. Wanted to put the point to the 3 of you that we've seen another form of disinformation in public news channels, in as much as there is a dumbing down of news. The trivial is juxtaposed with the important, and that in the very nature of a democracy, everybody can have an opinion, so that there really is no longer thought leaders in the genuine sense of the word. I see this on the BBC, and which is worldwide, and therefore you get stories that are really quite unimportant or personal. I mean, people love the personal and forget the really significant geopolitical issues which ought to grab our attention.
Dr. Leon, we'll start with you. All
right, I'll start with that second question. I'm not 100% clear on the recount issue, so I'm going to be very qualified in what I say. I mean, you have to look at the intent of the message, of course. If there's an intent to spread false information, it's disinformation. If it's just false information that's flowing around, it's of course misinformation. But I'm going to have to kind of look at the specifics of that. I don't think it's going to make a huge difference, given that Trump won with an overwhelming majority. I don't know if I would pay too much close attention to that. On the first question, I don't know if I can plead the fifth. Maybe I'll say, Hankulumi, Kulumane Loyayam. I think it's very hard for me to be optimistic right now in terms of what's going on in the US. I think I need a little bit more time and distance between this election and what's going to happen next. But if I'm pressed, I would say I do think it's really important that in the United States we have this debate, about constraining our freedoms versus focusing on self-regulation and those kind of measures. It's this kind of debate between negative freedom and positive freedom, and you see that kind of debate also playing out across the Atlantic between the United States and Europe. In the US, we assume we can regulate ourselves, and in the EU, we say, yes, we're for freedom, but if that impacts, the state of our security, the state of our democracy, we have to kind of look a little bit more closely at these issues. I think it's very different from what you see in Russia, for example. Russian doctrine is specifically spells out what they call information warfare, where they say propaganda is legitimate in peacetime or wartime. That is very important because, yes, I think in the West, for example, there are minor circumstances in which PSYOPs can be used, but I think there's generally consensus on both sides of the Atlantic throughout NATO that there are major ethical issues with that. I think the emphasis over the last few years has been much more about we need to focus on truth. Because the problem is once a country starts to spread disinformation, propaganda, then we start to question everything that country is doing, in terms of what they're saying. So that's a very important difference. I had a discussion with a Russian in Belgrade last year, and I said to him, I'm sorry. And he said, what for? I said, we are free and you're not. And he said, what do you mean? And I said, well, let me explain to you. I can run to the top of the stairs of Congress and shout, Biden is an idiot. And he said, yeah, we also have freedom in Russia. I can also run to the top of the stairs of the Kremlin and say, Biden is an idiot. But I think it just, the joke, of course, just shows that there's a big difference, I think, in the United States, where the greatest critic, for example, after the United States went to war in Iraq or Afghanistan, came from within. You won't find that in Russia, and I think that's really important. So if that's my 2 cents on what's positive about the United States, maybe that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, Karen?
I'm going to ask the BBC question. I worked for the BBC for 25 years, and I'm not an apologist for it, but I think you make a very good point about public service broadcasting, full stop. My first job at the BBC was in the Russian Affairs Unit. I'm really old, when the Berlin Wall came down, and these were stories that mattered, and it provided context, and the BBC at the time was considered, we had these Reithian goals to inform, to educate, and to entertain. These were the primary objectives of a public service broadcaster. And what happened over time is that more and more people decided they didn't want to pay for public service broadcasting, and they started going for other commercial broadcasters that were looking largely to be able to do things that were quite similar to what social media were doing. You were going and pushing what was most popular, demand-driven news. I think we have seen a dumbing down of news. I think it's happened industry-wide. I think part of it is because organizations like the BBC, and I'm not speaking for the BBC, I left in 2019, but I think they were very frightened about being accused of being elitist. I think you can be elitist without being elitist. I think you can be educational, and I think you can set the agenda and have, in a pluralist media environment, be able to set a tone, encourage debate, but provide guidance for your listeners, your readers, your viewers as to what matters in the world and what the world is talking about. But I think the biggest challenge has been actually financial, and we're seeing it not just with the BBC, we're seeing it, I talked to colleagues from the SABC recently when we were talking about disinformation more broadly, and I think one of the biggest challenges is that we're seeing an erosion of financing of newsrooms. So a lot of investigative journalism now is being financed by foundations. It's being financed by individual donors. Often those donors don't want to disclose who they are, because although they have no editorial say over the outcome, an association may undermine the story that they're promoting. I think what I would say, and I talk a lot to new generations of journalists, I don't know if is anyone here a trainee journalist? Are there any trainee journalists in the room, or wannabe journalists? Okay, I was in Ghana last week, and I was talking to a younger generation of journalists in their early 20s. And I asked, why do you want to be a journalist? And someone said they want to hold power to account. Another person said, I want to be famous. And another person said, I want to see it as a route to becoming an influencer. And I think that's one of our biggest challenges in our newsroom environment, is that we need to go back to first principles. That when we're training journalists to be able to populate our newsrooms in a very, very straitened times, in terms of straitened financial times, we need to remind our journalists what their job is. And their job is to go out and to report and to bear witness and to be able to provide all sides to a story. A journalist is not the same as an eyewitness. It's fantastic when someone on social media says, I saw an Uber driver's car being set alight and I'm reporting it. That's fantastic. You are an eyewitness. That is not the same as being a journalist that's able to go to the field to provide context, to be able to provide a wider argument of what is happening. So I think what my friend here has talked about is a global phenomenon about the erosion of public service broadcasting in particular, and I think we need to reboot the system, but we also need to ask people who are consumers of news in particular, what do you want? Do you want entertainment or do you want news? And do you want to be able to have the agency to decide for yourself what matters, what informs your voting decision, or do you want to be fed a diet of what is popular? And I think that's basically what we need to remind our next generation, without sounding, I don't mean to sound patronizing, but I think every generation needs a reminder of why the principles of journalism are so important.
Thanks, Gary. Thanks.
I think my last words would be say that certainly I think information is very important to democracy. Quality, relevant, and truthful information is very, very key to democracy. But as we have just heard, I think there's a lot of dumping down that's happening. It's not only dumping down, but also in our own context right now, what we are also seeing is media companies go online. They are coming up with what they call paywalls. Most of us can't afford those paywalls, which means we are going to continue to consume content outside of the paywalls. And most of the content that is outside of paywalls, most of it, if it's not misinformation, it's malinformation or it's disinformation. And I think that is the crisis that democracy faces going forward. How do you make sure that we don't have quality information behind the paywall, and outside of the paywall, there's just junky information? I think that is the crisis that we are facing going forward.
Colleagues, can we just have a word of... So, ladies and gentlemen, as you've all heard, misinformation, disinformation, AI is here to stay. But the key question is, can our leaders, can our governments put in place, regulatory frameworks that can, stream or counter misinformation and disinformation? With that said, I would like to say thank you to our speakers. Thank you to our host university and the delegation from the Lithuanian Republic for organizing this event. We look forward to having more events like this, actually. Dr. Zondo, the floor is yours. Thank you very much. Please, a round of applause.
All right. Once more to this amazing panel, let us give them a big round of applause. Thank you. All right. I think we had a very impactful program with a collection of speakers that are internationally acclaimed, of course. Right? So that has given us the opportunity to really drink from this well of wisdom. And for that, I want to say thank you to both panels, the first one and the second one. And to once again express my gratitude to our guests from all over the world. So thank you so much for taking your time to come and join us as we continue to commemorate 30 years of democracy in South Africa, and also in reflecting how that celebration is tightly linked to the liberation of Lithuania. This is a great moment. This is a great time to be alive. And again, to our struggle veterans, I feel really honored. You know, often because I'm not young, but I'm also not old. So often when we read about the times of oppression in the country, often it feels like it happened a very long time ago, almost as if you are reading about Aristotle. It's almost as if these are people that don't exist anymore. But somehow when you get to see the people that lived during that time, it refreshes your mind and it makes you even more grateful. So thank you so much on behalf of the University of Johannesburg and the Faculty of Humanities. Thank you. So as you will see that with the program, we had said that between 12 and 1, there will be food. Of course, in South Africa, usually after a funeral, but maybe a funeral is not a good example. But so you would say, when you are done, come and join us so you can wash hands. So to say wash hands means that come and fellowship through food. All right? So when I said to our moderator, no, it is because I thought food would be here. But now food is not here as yet. So we can't wash hands yet. But we'll use this time to network while we wait for the opportunity to wash our hands. All right? So, but in terms of the formal program, we have reached the end. So thank you so much. Let's give ourselves a big round of applause. Okay. So we are done. Thank you.